So pleased to introduce our speakers today. We have here Nicole Wong and Greg Nelson, who are going to talk to us about technology and policy, particularly based on their experience in Washington, D.C. and in the White House. Many of you know and remember Nicole. She was a lecturer here. We were lucky to have her then, and always happy to welcome her back. Nicole is the former U.S. Deputy Chief Technology Officer focusing on internet privacy and innovation policy. Some of you who were here a couple of years ago know that she helped sponsor a really exciting conference on data and policy. Prior to joining the Obama administration, Nicole served as the legal director for products at Twitter. Between 2004 and 2011, she was Google Vice President and Deputy General Counsel, primarily responsible for regulatory matters. She speaks a lot about the law, technology, including 5 appearances before Congress. And she is, most importantly, an advisor to the Berkeley School of Information. And she has a master's degree in journalism from UC Berkeley, as well as a BA from Georgetown. So join me in welcoming Nicole first. Greg has an equally impressive CV, but I will just give you the highlights. Greg is a former Chief of Staff Special Assistant to the President and Senior Advisor of the National Economic Council, which is also in the White House. He left the White House this summer after 6.5 years as a senior leader in economic policy, technology, and strategic partnership teams. See, I told you they'd show up. For 2 years, Greg was a chief of staff at the National Economic Council for Director Gene Sperling, where he coordinated economic policy development, managed strategy and communications, and worked across the White House and cabinet to develop and implement the president's economic policy priorities. Prior to, He's got all sorts of great things. He worked on the President's Council on Jobs and Competitiveness. He worked on public and private partnerships for the White House Office of Public Engagement. He also is not on this CV, but he worked in the Peace Corps, or for the Peace Corps, lobbying on behalf of the Peace Corps. Prior to the White House, Greg built and sold a technology company, developed startups in energy and biomaterials, and consulted for business nonprofits and foundations. And he has a BA in political science and history from Yale. Join me in welcoming Greg. And before I hand this over to our team, who is going to be low-tech and informal, I want to just remind you that there will be a reception afterwards in the hallway. And then at 6 p.m., there'll be a panel on careers in technology and policy. And I invite you all in room 210, which is down the hall. I invite everyone to join us for all of the above. Okay, over to you.
All right, is my microphone thingy working? Cool, all right. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Anno, for that lovely introduction. It's always fun for me to come back to the school and to see growing numbers of faces at the school. We were joking earlier today, like, we have no slides, we have no audio visuals, we are showing up low-tech and informal, and I was like, because government beat all the tech out of us. They handed us a Dell Latitude and a BlackBerry when we got there, and it's never been the same since. Greg and I actually first met at a meeting about the sharing economy at the White House, and the last administration, or this administration has been incredible about sort of diving deep on a lot of different tech policy issues. When Greg and I got to reconnect out here on the West Coast, because we both came home, we were talking about how it might be fun to share with you all sort of the view of the tech sector and technology, at least as it happens in the White House. Like a decade ago, I don't think it's too much of an exaggeration to say, if you wanted an informed conversation about technology in any given government agency, including the White House, you probably better go grab the IT guy in the basement in order to do that. In the short time that I was there, that changed. I'm sure in the 7 years that Greg was there, that changed dramatically. And so we thought we'd talk about a little bit how we viewed it from different components of the White House. I was in the Chief Technology Officer's division, Greg was at NEC, but he was actually in multiple different components of the White House. So we want it to be informal, conversational. Greg showed up in jeans. I would have worn jeans, but mine were dirty. We thought we'd do like a fireside chat format, and then halfway through we'll open it up for questions and more conversation, which is your cue to start thinking about your questions now. So let's begin. And I thought it would make sense to start with Greg, just because his service has been longer with the White House, and he served in more components of it. So maybe, Greg, you could talk about, you were an entrepreneur in the tech sector before you joined the administration, and maybe you could talk a little bit about what brought you to government in the first place.
Sure. Well, thanks everybody for coming out today, and it's a real treat for me to be here. My association with Berkeley goes back to when I was in high school, and my sister was going to undergraduate here, and the only way I grew up in Oregon, and one of the ways we could get a really fun trip as high school students was to go on a college visit, to come down and see my sister down here. So I think we visited Berkeley 4 or 5 times on college visits, and my brother-in-law Eric is here today as well. So they're still here in the community, which is really fun for me. So I kind of flip back and forth between the private sector and the public sector a couple of times, but always with kind of the general themes of looking at how to different ways to create change, whether it was through starting a business in biomaterials, or at a company that was focused on technology for campaigns, nonprofits, advocacy campaigns. In fact, getting back to how much things have changed in just the last couple of decades, one of the products that our company pioneered was a tool where if you went online, you could go to a website and send a message to your member of Congress. And the innovation that we had was that we took that message that you'd gone online to create and write and turned it into a fax that showed up in the congressman's office. Because when we went and interviewed the members of Congress, they told us, don't send us emails. Definitely don't send people to our office, but if you could turn that into a fax, we know how to deal with it. So our amazing innovation was taking an online and electronic form and turning it into paper that rolled off a fax machine, which gives you a sense of kind of where things were, and they are a lot better. I think that's a huge benefit. My path to the White House really started actually about this time 8 years ago, and for anybody that's thinking about getting involved in the campaign or doing something in this election, I think it's an interesting example. I didn't have any intention of moving back to DC again. I got inspired by what then candidate Obama was doing and trying to figure out how I could help. And there was a great group of clean energy and clean tech entrepreneurs here, some real leaders who had started to organize themselves under the banner of Clean Tech for Obama. And it was do it yourself. There was no campaign, didn't ask anybody to do it. They just got inspired, wanted to make an impact, and started organizing each other to get out and do events and talk about climate and clean energy. And Michael was a part of this in the very early days to help make sure that this conversation was brought into the campaign. That is often how a lot of people early in the administration end up building relationships and then joining the administration or the White House, is to work on the campaigns. For me, it led me to go back to DC during the presidential transition in November of 2008 with a full intention of staying for a couple months and a bit of an adventure, and then trying to get out of there before it got too cold in January and February. And I just came back this August. So. It was not exactly as I intended, but it was a great adventure. To Nicole's point about technology, one of the things I think we want to tease out a bit today is not just that the hard tech that we use in policymaking has changed quite a bit. In 2009, when we walked in the door, there were less than a dozen laptops in all of the White House. If you wanted one, you needed to check it out because you were traveling. Everything else was a desktop, and it was a best case a Dell. And in order to get work done on anything that required security, you had to be in the building itself. There was no way to do anything outside of the actual physical campus. That has dramatically changed, and that hardware side is different. But I think the software for how we make policy is also much different, and Nicole is a great example of that. I think we want to talk about that a bit more. That the requirements that you as a policymaker should have to make sure you're making the best decision have changed. You want to make sure that you understand the data and the technology and all the things that have you may take for granted other parts of the world, but that are relatively new into the policymaking process. I think that's a really exciting shift for all of us. The last point I wanted to mention on this is as you think about the kind of career side of things later tonight, for me, it's an incredibly exciting time to be involved in the technology and policy world, because the scale of the challenges are huge, and the scope with which we need to address them is huge. But the opportunity to be on the front lines of moving technologies as a solution to service providing by the government is huge and tremendous, and it's just not done that well yet, but there's a lot of progress. And so as big as the challenges are and as hard as we're seeing them play out in the 2016 campaign, it's actually a pretty exciting time to be involved in thinking about the role of data and technology in helping us have better solutions as policymakers, and the role of government is actually provide services to people, we certainly can do that a lot better, and the way that will happen is going to be through a better use of, more thoughtful use of technical solutions as well.
So, like, sometimes I joke with people from my time at the White House, like, so not like that Schoolhouse Rock thing about making a bill, and particularly not from the executive side. So could you talk a little bit about policy making from the executive branch and sort of how the sausage is made in that branch?
Yeah, absolutely. So everybody knows that probably from very early in your schooling, the way a bill becomes a law. So subcommittees look at an issue, move it to a committee, eventually it goes to the floor, and the House and the Senate vote on it. If it's the exact same and it passes both the House and the Senate, it goes to the President to sign it. In the executive branch, at the White House level, each administration tweaks, I guess would be a nice way to say it, changes the internal process quite a bit. But there are some standard elements that are there. So there are parts of the White House that are explicitly charged by the president with policymaking or with coordinating the policy process. And the three most commonly known are the National Security Council, which obviously does all of the national security policymaking process, and traditionally that is both domestic, sort of homeland security, and overseas. The second is the Domestic Policy Council, which is the sort of second oldest of the three, founded in the 1980s by President Reagan, and essentially coordinates the domestic policy agenda. And then third is the National Economic Council, which was created by President Clinton in 1993 and coordinates domestic and international economic policy. The exact mix of who does what and how is very dynamic. In our administration, things like education, immigration reform, a lot of the social safety net programs, and the real core elements of sort of government services were handled out of the Domestic Policy Council. And the National Economic Council did everything from policymaking around infrastructure, but also when when Europe ran into some real debt crisis, we were the sort of response team on that. Anything around economic policymaking would come through us. What that means essentially is that you're the lead body in helping to create a policy process. How do we actually decide what we're going to do? Example I like to use is around the long-term unemployed. This was a real challenge, and it continues to remain a challenge coming out of the economic recession in 2008, 2009, where while overall employment the unemployment rate has pretty dramatically come down, and we're actually at the lowest we've been in decades, and have created more jobs in that era than almost any recovery from a recession. There's been this persistent challenge of people who are long-term unemployed not getting back into the workforce. Long-term unemployed is somebody who's been out of work for 6 months or longer. The consequences for somebody who's out of work for 6 months or longer are very, very dire. Often you lose a house, could lose a spouse, and your lifetime earning and your ability to contribute back to society is degraded every month that you're out of the workforce. So this was a real challenge and something that we felt like required a policy intervention. The usual process for that would be the NEC, in this case, the National Economic Council, would convene a series of conversations internally involving all the other policy councils, so the domestic folks, the national security folks, but also the Chief Technology Officer's office, anybody who could have a potential role in the White House, but also in the agencies to develop ideas. one thing that we did a lot better later in the administration than earlier was to make sure that we asked those same questions of as many outside experts as we could find as well, and essentially ran a similar process of idea generation with those folks. And then you end up bringing those through a series of what we call deputies committee meetings, which are the sort of staff level meetings to develop your best ideas. Essentially, those get litigated between the senior staff at the White House in deciding what you can do and what are the policy pros and cons and the political pros and cons. What is the right thing to do, and how do we make sure we can get as much of that done, what's politically possible, and then that goes to the president for any final decisions. Your goal, as should be the case in most organizations, is to winnow the set of decisions that you ask each succeeding level decision maker down, so that the principals, the very senior staff, are just making a couple of key decisions at the top, and then anything that goes to the president is either wholly baked or just about baked as it gets there, and he's just making a couple of key trade-off decisions that are at that level. And then our teams all work together on how you actually implement the policy. What are all the stakeholders you can bring into it? How can you work with the private sector, the public sector, the nonprofit sector to actually build these pieces out? What's the role of states and localities in doing it? On long-term unemployed, we were faced with a decision: do we regulate this? It turns out when you look at the data that a lot of people who are unemployed for more than 6 months were not even being considered for jobs they were applying for, because so much of the job application process is handled through computer algorithms to screen individual candidates. And if a company had set a screen that they wanted somebody who was employed or recently employed, it would often actually just filter out people who were long-term unemployed, even if they had all the other characteristics of somebody who could be terrific at that job. So we were faced with a decision: do we try to regulate that? Do we use the president's executive powers around an executive authority and say, make this illegal? This is something that for federal contractors you are not allowed to do, and then would be punishable. Or was it a challenge that would be better fixed in looking at how to raise attention for this particular issue? Turns out when we went out and talked to most companies, they had no idea that this sort of screen had been set up. It wasn't something that they intentionally had done. It was almost the default that was built into the system. And so we decided, rather than creating a new regulatory stick, that we would use it as an opportunity to raise a bunch of awareness of it and work with the top 100 employers in the country on making sure that the barriers for people trying to get jobs at their companies were removed for the long-term unemployed. And we had an event in the White House to celebrate that. We did all of the different things we could to try to make that a sort of partnership process, rather than something where we went out and beat people over the head with a rule to make that happen.
Yeah, I think that struck me going into the White House, right? It's sort of, you think about the powers of the presidency, and he's the most powerful man in the world, except there's only a sort of limited number of tools he has. To bring legislation is sort of a dire situation these days, as we can tell now, right, in terms of some of the things we're doing with Congress. So legislation seems like the last option in a lot of ways, just because it's so difficult these days. I think one of the things I learned, right, is the most powerful tool is the convening, the bringing together and calling upon experts or people close to issues on something that's meaningful, and seeing if you can brew something out of that, which sounds so soft. And so crafting exactly, who do you want to bring together? What is it you're trying to accomplish? Is this a long-term or a short-term thing? Is such an art in many ways.
Yeah, and what's the ask,
right?
Figuring out what you can both legally and appropriately encourage people to do in their own private businesses and their own organizations or states that will make an impact in the area you're trying to affect, but that will also inspire them to do it. If it made sense for the business, they might already be doing it. So you have to try to prioritize this by using the power of the White House to do it.
Yeah.
You also get very creative in trying to figure out how you can make a point and break through. And I think one of the other changes over the course of our time is the media environment and the kinds of things you have to do to actually get people's attention. President Obama has made the fewest addresses from the Oval Office of any president in modern times, since television became the popular medium for presidents to talk to the public. And the reason for that is that nobody pays attention to it anymore. It's hard for the networks to give up the 9 p.m. slot, and frankly, not that many people are watching watching, or not as many people are watching TV on scheduled television 9 p.m. anyway. And so we had to do a bunch of other things to try to get folks' attention. One story that the other thing Nicole I joked about beforehand is you kind of have to do a little bit of everything. You're a troubleshooter as much as you are a grand policy schemer. Most of this is just trying to figure out how to get to a really good outcome in a difficult situation. I worked on the response to the Gulf oil spill back in 2010, and I remember vividly, in fact, the day that the oil spill happened, because I was working with a public engagement team at the time, and we'd organized an Earth Day celebration in the Rose Garden in the White House, brought all of the national leaders of environmental groups together. This was a big, grand moment. We were building towards a vote on a climate and energy bill in Congress. We'll later pass the House. And it was really like an exciting moment for me as a clean energy person. And I get to work that day, and the first thing that is put on my desk is, well, there was this little incident last night, it turns out, down in the Gulf, and it turned out obviously into a major environmental and human disaster. When that finally, and it was a very difficult 4 or 5 months as we worked through that process, when the spill was finally capped, the well was finally capped, and we were able to move out of the sort of immediate emergency response, a lot of the attention went to how do you help build the economic situation into a much better place for folks in the Gulf, in particular around New Orleans. If you remember, basically tourism stopped. It's a big seafood producer. Nobody was eating Gulf seafood. Nobody was eating Gulf fish. Nobody was hitting the beaches. It was a big deal when the president went and swam in the Gulf of Mexico on a vacation. But we had to figure out how do we get creative in showing that this is now safe, and that we needed to do something to support the people in the Gulf. So we did a couple things, some of which were easier than others. The president went on vacation there and swam in the water with his daughters, which sent a very important signal about the safety of it. We also had the fortunate timing that year that the New Orleans Saints had won the Super Bowl, and were coming up to the White House to do their Super Bowl visit. If you win the Super Bowl, you get to come visit the White House, and the president congratulates you. So we concocted this kind of crazy scheme, which was, if our goal was to convince people that Gulf seafood is safe and you can eat it again, what better way to show that than to actually have the White House staff, in particular the White House team that had been working on this issue and that had seen the testing and knew everything was safe, to actually eat it ourselves. So we invited a whole host of New Orleans chefs to come to the White House, and they and the New Orleans Saints cooked meals together. And then one of the chefs created a 40-foot po' boy sandwich that we laid out across the White House, and invited our entire team to come and celebrate the good work of getting the well capped and getting things back to normal, and invited the press to come see it. And as you can imagine, 60 staffers, 100 press, and the president's team eating a sloppy po' boy sandwich in the middle of the White House was kind of a zoo, but it did the thing we wanted to, which was it got attention for the issue, and we had to do something creative, and we had to do it in a way that would prove the point, the policy point that we were trying to make. Again, we couldn't have regulated that. There wasn't a way to do that through traditional policy, but we could use the power of convening in our stomachs, I guess, to try to make a point. Cool. All right, I get to ask questions. So, just as a point of reflection, I think when Nicole came to the White House, it was a real exciting moment for folks like me who'd been there for a while, because it really showed the importance of senior technology policy leaders joining the team. That hadn't always been something that was part of the standard White House. It was something the president brought in, and recognizing that layer of both technology policy, but also that people understood the important power of technology in every other policy area were a vital part of it and needed to be at the table. And so when you start having people of Nicole's caliber show up to your meetings, it's an incredibly important signal to the rest of the White House and the rest of the world that this is now the default for what should happen in all these situations. So I was very excited to have her join. But you kind of came in at a point when and we're seeing some of this now, but the relationship between Silicon Valley and Washington has been up and down, and a lot of different things that have moments where it's had its highs and lows. When you're thinking about your time from inside companies, how did the Valley view the federal government and its role, and then what led you to decide to take the leap out of Google and Twitter, and to come to a place where you literally couldn't get Twitter when you first walked in the door.
That was so brutal. So I'm going to flip the answer a little bit, which is just like, because I often get the question, like, how do you get into the White House? Like, did you contribute a lot of money? I'm like, I contributed no money. It's a phone call that you get, and I literally had to sit down because the White House was calling, and I'm like, I've never gotten a call from the White House. So I sat down literally on the steps of my front hallway, and as it happened, it was sort of this, we'd love you to come and serve, in this role of in the CTO's office. Todd Park, who would be my boss, is a tremendous person, inspiring at almost every level I can think of, and so they actually caught me in this moment. It was January of 2013. I had just lost my grandfather, and I am a fourth-generation Chinese American. My grandfather had always been a contributor to the community. He had worked on the immigration bill to lift racial caps off of immigration, and he had taught me this thing, which I then had just said at his eulogy, which is, it is our right to participate in our community and the governance of our country. And if we get the opportunity, it is our privilege and our responsibility to do so. So having just said that, and then getting this call, and like, I don't know how to explain to my kids if I don't go do this thing. So collectively, my family and I made a decision that we were all going to move across the country and serve. And it is a full family service when you do it. So that was the reason for me to go. And I think I've said it to some folks at the iSchool before. We don't get to complain about policy in our country, in our technology fields, if we don't participate in the creation of that policy. A good friend of mine who served with me, Jen Polka, who's the executive director of Code for America, she puts it this way. She's like, when you're sitting and complaining about the traffic, you are the traffic. And it is the same in government. If you sit and complain about your government, you are the government. So make your move, right? This is your calling as much as anybody else's. And so that was the reason I decided to go at that time. I do think, having worked in the Valley since, let's see, the late 90s, it sounds so horrible, but right, like, and counseling a whole range of clients before I actually went in-house at Google in 2004, I think that there continues to be a libertarian streak in Silicon Valley and the tech sector generally. Was during most of the period where I did a lot of work engaging with governments here and around the world, a sense from the tech sector that your government is at least an obstacle, maybe just irrelevant to what it is you're trying to accomplish, because you're moving fast, you're iterating multiple times on your app, so like they just need to get out of the way. And I think that has been a pervasive sense of government for the Valley, and a lot of the reason why the tech sector has been slow to create expertise in Washington, D.C. and in state capitals to sort of influence how tech policy would work. So here's my entrance. I interviewed in January of 2013. I accepted the job in April of 2013. And I thought to myself, oh, so my friend said, okay, so I have 3 things you're going to work on. Focus on those 3 things. I was like, I'll do some internet governance. I'll do some freedom of expression, because Secretary Clinton had like sort of opened the door to like free expression is an important global value. Maybe I'll do some privacy. And my family was ready to move in July of 2013. On June 5th, the Snowden disclosures started. All of my priorities got thrown out the window. My boss, Todd Park, called and said, can you be here now, for example? And so my first day was, in fact, June 20th. And that is sort of the way it works. You were advised, like it's supposed to be like, find your priorities, focus on your priorities, because the clock is ticking and you want to get stuff done, and you shouldn't get distracted by the small but seemingly urgent stuff. But the fact of the matter is, the Gulf happens, right? Or Snowden happens, and what you are needed for is something different than you thought you were going there for.
And what about the role of the technologist in policymaking and thinking about how to both integrate that, but is there a way to bake that into the process in some way?
It is, I mean, hugely so. And I think, you know, the first CTO started in the first administration of Obama with Anish Chopra, and I think has progressively grown to a very embedded technology group at the federal level now. And I can talk about that a little bit more, but I think what came to me, particularly that first week when I got my Latitude and my BlackBerry, was like, we need many more of us sitting at the table to help make policy decisions, because there are technical obstacles as well as technical opportunities that exist, which for folks who don't have that background simply don't realize that it's one of the things they can put on the table as a possible option, right? Or something that's worth discussing. And I think that we saw a lot of instances where we missed an opportunity to open the door for that. What I see now in the current CTO's office, for example, Megan Smith is a tremendous technologist with a great understanding of innovation labs all around the world. Ed Felton, who is a cryptology expert, is fabulous to have in the Office of Science and Technology Policy. But then we are embedding executives who were previously at Amazon, at eBay, at Salesforce, like all throughout the agencies of government. And that is critical, I think, to sort of reinventing the delivery of government services.
Yeah. Could you talk, I mean, the CTO office was created in 2009 when the president came in and has evolved along with, even as the economy has gotten more and more tech-enabled.
Yeah.
I think the White House has as well. We talk a bit about the kind of theory behind the office, how it's organized,
yeah.
How it interacts with the public, and as we think about how the White House might respond to something,
right.
How to think of the CTO's office.
Yeah, Team CTO sits within the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House, so it's technically independent, actually, from the White House office. And I think every CTO has sort of brought different staffing, different priorities to bear. So I'll talk just about while I was there under Todd Park. Todd is a two-time entrepreneur, particularly in the healthcare sector. He deeply understands technology, and he, in the time that I was there, had 4 deputies, one that focused on open data and open government. So really looking at how our federal government deals with data generally. One on digital services, so about reinventing government in a digital way. That was led by Jen Palka, that I mentioned earlier, who was the executive director of Code for America. One on telecommunications, so during the most important period of discussing both the delivery of broadband services, but also net neutrality. Tom Power was our expert within the White House about telecommunication services. He sat right next to me in the office, and literally, like, he would have these conversations that went so far over my head. I was like, I had to make him slow down several times in the conversation. And then I had the Internet and Innovation portfolio. And that was how we sort of divided up the work and the priorities, although there was lots of crossover among all of us. I think Megan Smith has really been able to bring a couple different things. One is sort of a real focus on innovation because her background is there. She's also brought a wonderful amount of attention to diversity within the tech sector. And that's been a big priority for her, and she's been hiring in that capacity as well, which I think has been super for the team.
Before we open it up for questions, do you want to talk a little bit about U.S. digital services and TNF and some of the ways that have opened up for people to be able to participate?
Yeah, I brought notes because I sometimes get the numbers wrong. So like we were saying, like, sort of bringing better technology into government has been happening since the first administration. but we keenly felt it and had a moment for really changing the way everything got done with the train wreck, and I don't say that lightly, the train wreck that was healthcare.gov. So if you'll recall, right, in the fall of 2014, we were supposed to start enrolling people for the Affordable Care Act on a website that would give them choices around getting health care. That system was supposed to be able to enroll millions. It was supposed to have the capacity to enroll 500,000 people per day. And when it launched in November, it was October, it was enrolling 500 people per day. That was the maximum capacity it could handle. 55% of the people went through. 45% could not create an account on healthcare.gov in those first couple of months. It's a login system, right? Like, this is not rocket science. It's like, people do this, Amazon does this, every other website seems to be able to do this. All it was a login system. We spent $800 million building the healthcare.gov site. There were 55 companies involved in its development, and it did not work. Which is like, it should make all of us just absolutely wince with pain that's a possibility, right? So what happened was, in realizing that this technical crisis was happening and standing in the way of a presidential priority, like, if nothing else, healthcare for President Obama is a signature of his entire administration, and we can't log anyone in, felt like all hands on deck. And in fact, that's what happened. My boss, Todd Park, created what we called the rescue team of the best expertise we could find inside and outside of government to go in and fix the healthcare.gov site. They were there for 3 months, pretty much round the clock. We were, in our office, we were literally packing them lunches to take over to this small office where they were trying to reinvent this thing. Because what they had done was, the healthcare.gov system was built in a waterfall development model, right? So like this notion of get all the way through complete one model, and then that triggers the second stage of development, each of which was being done separately. So it was no surprise when you put it all together, it didn't actually work. Todd's group worked on agile development format, right? Sort of collaborating with each other and iterating and testing all the way through the development process. And by the end, we're able to get the system up and running so that I think by January, we had 8 million people enrolled, which was huge, which is so important. I'll tell you a little bit about that system and just the login as a key part of it, right? The old system responded to requests somewhere between 2 and 10 seconds long to respond to a request. The new system takes 30 milliseconds on average. The old login system cost $250 million, just the login system, to build. And it would have required $70 million annually to stay online. The new system cost about $4 million, and its annual maintenance cost is a little less than $1 million. We need more of these folks in government all the time. There is $86 billion spent in IT in the federal government. 94% of IT projects are over budget and behind schedule. And 40% of those projects actually never see the light of day. They obsolesce before they actually get launched. So like, the amount of waste happening in that sector or that part of our government is outrageous. So I know you're having a career day panel. Go to government, because we desperately need you to solve this problem. And one of the signatures, I think, from the CTO's office under Todd Park is to create paths for technologists to come into government. So what Todd tends to talk about it as like a 3-layer cake. Under his tenure there, they established the U.S. Digital Services, which is sort of the top layer of that cake, and identifies priorities within the administration of technical projects to work on. So The healthcare system is obviously one of them. The Veterans Administration system is another one of them. The immigration system is a third. And so they identify these projects and try and scope with those agencies what does a solution start to look like. And these are mostly technical folks helping in that process. Then there's a second layer of the cake called 18F, which are folks who are around the country, technologists and designers, who are then brought into the agencies to sort of keep moving the train along in terms of actually scoping the project, making sure everyone's coordinated, and also doing sort of broader things like what was just recently put out as the USDS playbook, so that like there's sort of a template for how folks develop within government. Then the final is the Presidential Innovation Fellows. So if you think about like USDS is sort of the highest level, 18F, you probably want, they are folks coming out of private sector, devoting some period of time. Presidential Innovation Fellows are actually there for 6 months to a year on average. So it's sort of designed to allow someone who doesn't necessarily want to walk away from their private sector job to do a sabbatical or something more lightweight, but be of assistance on something critical in government and get a taste for that. And so you have this whole layering of an ability to bring people in on all layers of their expertise and within government to sort of embed more digital expertise into our government. And working on some of the most important projects that I can think of there.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the really exciting thing, somebody who was there before a lot of these folks started coming in for government service, is it now essentially means that you can't and you shouldn't and you can't have a meaningful policy discussion about how are we going to solve this challenge for the American people without having members of the technology team in the room as decision makers, as folks who are adding to the conversation, and as a new tool in the toolkit. So that, immigration is a great example. Among the many challenges the immigration system has faced is that just these long periods of limbo for people who have already been approved to get a green card or to move to the next phase in their eventual path toward citizenship. And a lot of that is actually a technical challenge. It's not because the law stipulated that that's the way it should be. It's because the systems didn't talk to each other in a way that allowed someone to actually know what their current status was and how long their wait time was going to be. So we might not have been able to make the progress we wanted with Congress to make some changes to the immigration system, some of the changes in the law, but you could certainly make the experience a lot better for taxpayers who are participating and trying to move through the system. So that to me adds an entire new set of tools to the federal government's capability, and then a lot of that stuff now flows down or up from cities and states, so that your expectations as a citizen should, for your government should be able to do, should include all these elements. And I think that's one of the biggest changes in the 8 years that we'll see out of this administration, embedding it in so that whoever comes next, this will already be baked into the entire process. Nobody will ever not be able to have a CTO at the White House, which I think is incredibly exciting. Yeah, exactly.
I will say, like the CTO's office, right, explicitly technology focused, but for a group at NEC, how do you think about bringing in the technologists to the conversation? Like, what are the nuts and bolts of operating a group that's not explicitly a technology-focused group?
That's interesting. So one of the roles I had was the chief of staff for the NEC. So NEC is about 35 people, and the scope of what the NEC is supposed to be able to tackle or policy is, the scope of the global economy. So 35 people is quite tiny. So you really have to focus in on what are the immediate challenges we have, and how do we essentially either firefight on those or build for the long term on another place that we think we can make an impact. During my time there, saw a real change in the type of staffing that we would look for and bring in. In the first couple of years, where a lot of the action was working with Congress on things like the Recovery Act and the Affordable Care Act, Dodd-Frank and Wall Street Reform, you wanted people that had technical experience in making laws with Congress. Over time, that has now shifted, where a lot of the folks who are the policymaking team at NEC come from the private sector. They may have a consulting background. They may have worked in private sector companies. They're lawyers. They're folks who have more of a problem-solving mechanism to what they're doing, because the answer to what we talked about earlier is much less likely to be a new law done with Congress, and much more likely to be something that we can implement through executive authority or through a partnership with the private sector or public organizations to try to get it done. All the things the president's doing around computer science for all, helping to create pathways for, I think it's 100,000 new computer science teachers in high schools. All of that is happening through partnership between the administration and the private sector and states who run the school districts to try to make those pieces happen. There's no new law that has been created in any of those elements, but it's inspiring dramatic change because you have that kind of integrated thinking as part of the policymaking process.
So, fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for coming. I have two questions. One is about the healthcare disaster. I mean, it seems like the problem there was early in the process in selection of a vendor. So I'm sort of wondering how that happened and whether there's something in place to avoid that kind of problem in the future. And then I'm completely fascinated by this 18F organization, and I wonder if you can just, first of all, what does 18F even stand for? And I just think it's, as an institutional innovation, it sounds like it's very cool because it's something that's now at the local level that's implementing, as I understand it, you know, throughout the country. And so I'd love to hear more about how it works.
How much do you know about the procurement? So healthcare.gov procurement existed before I got there, but I have a feeling you might have been
I can do a little bit on the procurement side. I mean, I think there were a lot of lessons learned conversations coming after healthcare.gov. There was a lot of introspection that happened, and and rightly so. And there are a couple areas that I think got segmented out for looking for a new approach. Procurement is one of them, and certainly IT procurement being one of the largest, in that the way the system is now, it really preferences very large, pre-existing IT vendors who have done large projects before, often without a lot of metrics on success in terms of the budget and timeline of previous projects, but if they've been a previous contractor, they leap up to the top regardless, again, of their performance. And the cost with which for a company to take on to become a vendor for the federal government is enormous. So it essentially eliminates, you know, most of the young, innovative companies from even imagining participating in it. So there's been a lot of innovation on that side since healthcare.gov, looking at ways that you can use different contracting tools to have younger, more innovative, smaller companies come on and be a part of the solution. And some of them were just forced through in order for us to finish healthcare.gov, and then some of them are going to become longer-term elements that are built around innovation rather than security. The challenge with healthcare.gov, I think, ended up being two pieces. One was the procurement process, which wasn't just followed the usual pattern. There was nothing new about it, and it failed in the same way previous patterns have failed, which should have been no surprise. But one of the things we took away from it, and the other area we've tried to attack, is that the team that was doing the policy implementation, helping to write the rules for how somebody would get coverage, how you would verify their income level so that you could decide whether they were able to get subsidies, which allowed us to understand what they had available for them in their state. That team was writing a set of rules that were being designed to be published in the Federal Register as if that was the end product. And then there was a technology team separately that was taking that set of rules and trying to apply them into a technical solution, algorithm, and in many cases 3 or 4 different layers of it. And because those pieces never talked, the intention of some of the rules never actually made their way into the technology, and then there was a bunch of assumptions that were made about what they were trying to be that were built into the system. So you had duplicative and triplicative systems all across the board because people didn't understand they were writing the code, didn't understand, didn't have access to people who were actually writing the rules. And so that, one of the things that we know that has to get fixed is an integrated process for that, where the people writing the rules understand how they're going to get used, and if it's primarily for an implementation through a web solution, all those people need to be in the room together in order to sort it out. There are very few new projects that will be quite as complicated as healthcare.gov, but you look at what's happening with the Veterans Administration, and a lot of that same thinking has now had to go into reimagining how you actually track and support the speed with which veterans can get access to care and with which their cases can continue to to be utilized.
So I'll answer the 18F question. The 18F group is like 90 or so technologists now, maybe a little bit more than that. They are housed in the General Services Administration, which is located at the corner of 18 and F Street. They they thought of a number of different possible names, all of which were like, yeah, you can't have that name. So they went simple, and 18F became the name of the group. They are, there's actually a group here in San Francisco at Civic Center, which houses a bunch of them. They have tried to be able to accommodate the fact that some of our best expertise who want to help don't actually want to move to Washington, D.C. And the type of work they do can be done from farther away. But they do, they have this mandate, right, to sort of be the translator between the policy objectives and the technical solution. And that is both design focused, of like sort of a user-centered design is the mandate that comes out of 18F, as well as sort of thinking through the full flow of the project in terms of, like, what is the end result you want, and what are the stages at which you're going to test and iterate and rethink all of that. So it's a wonderful group of folks.
It's been funny to watch that as different agencies across the government and leaders in those agencies learn about 18F and then see a example of having a service provider inside the federal government that can help them move at a quicker pace and get closer to their users, to the customers, the taxpayers. The spread like wildfire, and you had people in meetings sitting in the Roosevelt room of the White House saying, how do I need to know how to find the 17 and G people. I'm like, well, I think what you're going for is 18F. I understand that's a problem, but this is what it is. But they nobody knew quite what it was or how, but you had the Secretary of Commerce sitting there saying, I need that, whatever that thing is. And that was really just this, it's a translation engine from your product to your customers.
I think Ash Carter met with a group of the USDS folks. He's like, I want 10 of them. Give me 10.
I would like to procure 10 of them.
like packets of pencils. Like, come on, bring them over.
I think that the iSchool students are great.
Oh my goodness.
So, yeah, so we're actually lucky enough to have one of our alums work.
Yay.
So my question is actually about the revolving door, in that the technology in government, specifically directed at Silicon Valley, typical criticism has been revolving door was good for Google is good for America type take. But at the same time, it seems like what is desperately needed is knowledge that is technology knowledge that is outside the kind of free contractor dominance that gets those 25 or 50 parts of healthcare.gov and bids on them and kind of perpetuates the cycle of software that never gets delivered. So I'm just curious what your comment is on the revolving door and whether or not over time you might see that what's good for Silicon Valley is good for America. And just to make one comment on that is one of our alums, Ashkan was just recently the chief technologist at the FTC, is one of the few technologists in our space who was actually truly independent. Did not work at any large companies over his career, and yet his White House position was retracted because he did not pass the security background check.
Interesting. You could talk about from the Google Twitter experience, and I'm happy to talk about it more broadly.
Well, so just to go to the revolving door, and I'll talk about it mostly in the context of like U.S. digital services, because that was stood up recently, right?
Yeah.
And they actually term out at 4. They can't spend more than 4 years there, and there's a bunch of bureaucratic reasons for that. But it was actually deliberated and thought to be the right choice because we do want people cycling in private sector to public sector because they stay fresh and because fresh eyes actually really are important about like what's happening out there in the private sector and the environment, and can we bring those techniques and those technologies into government. So like I think that there was twofold. One, a deliberate intent to have freshness within digital services. And the second, frankly, is I think when I talk to people and try and tell them go serve, most folks in the tech sector, it's a very competitive environment. They want the free food from Google or Twitter or Airbnb or whatever, right? Like, so to get them to go and serve in government, to tell them that it's a short-term stint or that one of their options is a short-term stint is actually more of a selling point than saying, hey, you're now a government worker.
Yeah. Go ahead.
First of all, I'm crushed the bill on Capitol Hill. That was like, but anyway, one of the things that I think needs to be addressed, when they had the Gulf oil crisis, there were a lot of leading minds and things that were afraid to talk because they got grants and everything, they were tied into the government. So I actually had to go on ABC and explain, and not the most, I mean, and say, what would you have done in this crisis? And I said, well, maybe we put 2 aircraft carriers underneath and created a giant sling so that they wouldn't sink because of the fire.
Yeah.
And the idea was get world experts to work on world problems. I think one of the problems with the Gulf was they sent too many lawyers and not enough engineers. And people were afraid to talk and solve problems. And I think the White House should lead a group of international experts when there's a crisis, a Fukushima or something, where we call the global community together and say, we're going to solve this problem, and also have these tools. We know hurricanes are going to hit, people are going to need to match people. So I think there should be an expanded focus on trying to figure out, put these councils together so when an emergency hits, we call the top people from around the world to solve the problems rather than create bigger ones.
Yeah, I think it's a great point in that that intersection is something that is constantly being redefined and how both the White House and other parts of the administration work with outside experts, and what's the right way to do that, the right kind of transparency, how do you make sure that it doesn't involve revolving door problems, and that sometimes you can throw open the doors and allow people to provide their expertise. In my experience, we did it through a couple of ways. There's the formal councils. So one of the things I worked on was the President's Council on Jobs and Competitiveness, which was 25 private sector leaders, including Dr. Tyson from here at Berkeley, as well as Jeff Immelt, who was the CEO of GE, was the chair of the council. And they met. The president insisted we meet quarterly, do it on a schedule like the private sector, meet quarterly with him, have very specific deliverables. But that process was wholly open. Every meeting was live streamed. The advice that they were giving was all posted online, and there was a formal process for that. In a situation like the oil spill, people were flooding our inboxes with ideas, some of which were great and some of which were little harebrained. But we didn't know which ones were going to be great, so we needed to figure that out. And so we actually had to set up a process with the EPA and FEMA to intake ideas and vet them so that we didn't miss anything that could have provided a solution, not just to the spill itself, but to the oil cleanup and all the elements that were there. And so you have to be flexible in how to get the best advice and make sure that it's getting to the right people at the right time, and that doing it in a way that continues to be transparent. I will say one other thing that crises have tended, as they tend to do, to provide moments to expand what's possible. And an example of that is when Hurricane Sandy hit New Jersey and New York. Airbnb was fairly new at that time, but had quite a number of users in the hurricane-struck regions. And so naturally, a couple of things. Actually, Twitter was a big piece of this too. People start using the tools that they have. People were using Airbnb to offer their extra bedrooms and homes to people who'd lost their homes in Hurricane Sandy, and that provided a whole bunch of housing that the federal government didn't have to put people in trailers. Instead, they were staying with friends and neighbors and relatives. We've now formalized that process with that company and a range of others, so that you can stand that up very quickly in the course of a disaster. And a similar thing happened with gas lines and Twitter, where people had started sharing online which gas stations had gas, which ones had power, which ones had neither, and we were spending all night, every night, trying to figure that out from federal data resources. And finally, this was a great example where the CTO's office helped us. So look, people are doing it. Our work is already happening. And so we realized we could put out the call, take the data that was coming in from public sources that people were already sharing with themselves, and we used that in order to target which gas stations we would try to do remote power sources to. And then eventually we were actually literally sending trucks with gas to these stations to refill based on what we were learning from what people were posting online on Twitter and Facebook, because that was just much faster and with pictures more accurate than we were going to find by government sources.
I do think like the outside expertise is critical in my experience, particularly in the technology sector. At the CTO's office, we did a couple things to bring in outside expertise exactly to identify like how could we, not maybe in a crisis mode, but figure out how to do certain things better and faster. So we would have hackathons and data jams.
Yeah.
Total CTO thing, right? So data jams were like everyone who has some interesting data, bring it together, we'll figure out what would be some interesting ways to use it. And it would be theme focused, like in education, in environment, and in disaster relief. Another would be a hackathon where you'd bring people from private sector, public sector, nonprofit, and figure out like, well, you community, what do you need? All right, so you technologists, what can you build? Like, and have them spend a day at the White House sort of basically trying to hack a solution, at least at sort of a baseline level. Some of them actually come up with demos at the end of a like 12-hour day, which is amazing, but most of them are just sort of like specs on like, here's what might be done. And then you hope that that sort of propagates afterward, that people have continuing conversations around that. To your point about like just having some of the lawyered up conversations versus candid conversations, I actually think one of the most gratifying things I did while I was at the White House was this, the president asked us to do a 90-day study on the implications of big data, and Anna mentioned Berkeley was, and Deirdre Mulligan and Anna was one of the schools we did it at. We had 90 days to write a full report, public sector and private sector use of big data. And the typical way of doing this at the White House would have like, you do convenings, you invite in experts to sit at the White House and tell you all they know. What we were able to do in that period was actually have 3 academic conferences, one at MIT, one at NYU, and one here at Berkeley. And Deirdre and I and the other organizers went back and forth. They were like, what do you want us to do? And I'm like, I want you to have an honest conversation. So I'm telling you that I want you to lean into the hard questions. The easy questions, like the abusive use of data or the innocuous use of data, those settle themselves out. Focus your mind on the hardest part of the questions around data, and like, let's go there and have an honest conversation. And the conference here was beautiful and really delivered on hard conversations and hard policy trade-offs. And I think that was the most important thing that we could contribute and present to the president at the end of the day, were where those difficult areas were going to be.
In the 21st century, having a digital government, I think, is a great thing, and bless you guys for working so hard on that, because we really need people to work on that. But this weekend, I saw an interview with the richest guy in India, and one of his initiatives is to get all 1 billion Indians online, because you could have the most wired up government in the world, but if it's not connected to its citizens, it doesn't matter. So I guess I'm wondering, from your vantage point, is the public sector going to do that, or is the private sector going to drive that? Because it seems like in a lot of other countries, the private sector is the engine that makes it happen, not the government.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about broadband?
Well, I think it's probably likely to be a public-private partnership, right? Like that the public sector has to provide the right incentives for the private sector to do the deployment, because frankly, the public sector is not likely to be the one building all of this infrastructure. I think we've done some of these public-private sector partnerships really well. Wiring up schools, for example, would be one example of that. And I don't know if the NEC had other.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. And it's similar in some ways to some of the challenges with rural telephone service and some of the other partial mandates, partial redistribution, and partial partnership. In order to get telephone service and even water into some of the most far-flung parts of the country, it has to be the right incentives, but the deliberate intention to do it will, like that necessity will likely come from the government, and then you can make it so that it's going to be financially appropriate for firms to come out there as well. The other thing I'd say is we increasingly begin to think of the and I think this is happening broadly, the internet as a sort of access to it as fundamental for economic prosperity, for education, for access to information and justice, all of the things that we hold dear as a country, having the access to the internet provides it's one of the ways that you can access those rights, and the data supports that, and not just here but overseas, and how much a person's the outlook for them and their family improves once they have access to information and to the internet. So as a development tool and as an economic inequality fighting tool here, it became one of the areas that we really focused on the economic side. How do we get high-speed internet to schools so that it can be a tool for learning, and also those kids don't fall behind kids who can have access to that everywhere they go, but also public housing and affordable housing facilities, libraries, and homes to make sure that people have access to it. It changes the likelihood that you and your family are going to be able to access things that are going to help you move up the income scale.
Question here.
So you were both talking about the reactions to disasters with the Gulf and with Snowden and with healthcare.gov, and for example with healthcare.gov, I can see there, I mean, there's the cushy Silicon Valley jobs, but also there's the I also think it's partly like leadership has to do with it, and culture, and like Obama, like in terms of executives wanting to come to DC to work on problems when they may not feel like they're going to be heard, or the advice they're willing to give, there's not going to be much impact that they're going to provide. And Obama did start the CTO role, and then I've seen Todd Park speak. He's like an electrifying evangelist, and so he was like a really big leader in healthcare and doing like the Free the Data campaign early before healthcare.gov happened, and working on technology and government and trying to do that. But it wasn't until healthcare.gov happened, there was a crisis that really, then there was a focus and leadership and the mustering of like getting support for this and getting 18F started. And so just, I guess, is it a little disheartening that it requires something on that scale for something to really happen? And then also, what are the things that are happening now that are really big priorities that are not getting the attention I think that it could deserve? And hopefully there's not some crisis that happens to like really shine the light on it. So I just...
Yeah.
So I don't know of any impending crisis, but you know, it's an election year, so anything could happen. Yeah. So Todd very deliberately, and the president very deliberately, created U.S. Digital Services and 18F with what they call air cover, right? Which is that they were going to intercede with any agency, any individual who was going to, for whatever reason, felt inclined to stand in the way of a project. An innovation or a reinventing of the government. I think that you're right. I wish healthcare.gov hadn't had to be the impetus to really push it along. I mean, it was in motion already, but the healthcare.gov kind of made clear to everyone how a technical issue could get in front of a policy priority, right? And I think we've learned from that. And honestly, I think now it's all about execution, because we proved that we can fix a healthcare.gov. We are making measurable change now at the VA and in other areas. And when the secretaries and their staff see real change happening, then it enables them to get on board. So goodness kind of propagates more goodness in that sense. I can't imagine under any administration, under whichever party it ends up being, that a government agency would turn that down, right? That is a source for reducing their costs, improving their delivery of services, making their overall lives better. And that, I think, has been sort of the slog of keep going, even in the face of some tough stuff. I do think the air cover provided in the first several months or year of building it was critical.
Yeah, I think it's, to Nicole's point, it's about utilizing the spotlight that positive and negative crisis bring to situation to accelerate the pace of change. A lot of the ideas that were already moving were were happening, but they were and had been initiated by the CTO's office and the president early on. But what healthcare.gov did was focus on all of us on making sure that these things not only accelerated the reform that was happening, but that you instilled and basically baked them in to the expectations for what people have from their government, and as implementers from the inside, your expectations for how you're going to get your job done. So same thing. Would you wish it had not happened? It would have been great if it had been a beautiful launch and had been impeccable UI and just a beautiful experience. But I think a part of it is that the ideas were for how to fix it were there, and then how to fix it long term. And that's the same thing, and whether it's a forced human-created crisis or a natural disaster, it's the response to that, and where the culture of each administration, I think, really comes out is in how you respond to those kinds of situations, and then what you bake in for the long term. And I hope that's, for me, one of the real legacies, I think, of this administration that everybody can be most proud of is the trying to figure out how to bring in the disruptive opportunities of technology into the service providing and policymaking process. And I think that's something that is now fundamental to the way every White House will work from here on.
Yeah, so aside from joining government, what would be the best way for academics to sort of gain visibility with respect to our ideas to sort of influence policymaking? So for example, I'm told that James Comey sort of reads Lawfare every morning. And so I guess in the West Wing, do you guys have things that you typically read on a daily basis? And so for policy discussions as well, like what are sort of the predominant ways you get your information to sort of go into these discussions?
That's a great question.
That is a good question.
Like
I was saying, there was a long period where I couldn't access Twitter from my desk in the White House.
Yeah. One of my biggest disappointments in joining the White House, and this is the first month in there, was I kind of assumed there would be like an omniscience panel that somebody would just hand me that had perfect data and great information and the best ideas on every issue, because you're at the White House, right? Like that stuff should exist. It should just be aggregated and in a dashboard, and I would just have to push some buttons and make it work. And it turns out that rather than your scope expanding, it narrows very quickly, and the information sources, you have to really fight to make sure that you're getting the best information, you're finding the good ideas that are there. So the couple pieces of advice I would have is, one is never assume that the people who are making policy on an issue you care about have in their brains already the best ideas or who the best thinkers are on that. And when I worked in the public engagement side, that was one of our roles, was we know that the president thinks this issue, thinks housing reform is going to be a key element of the next 2 years. Let's go try to find the people who have the best information, the best data, and bring them in, and then ask them who else they listen to and who else they talk to. So to the extent that you're, and this iSchool here is a great resource for that, your ability to actually connect directly with some of those policymakers on some of the issues you're working on is critical, especially if you can aggregate that in a way that is easily consumable by those folks. The second is the one thing that the White House and all policymakers just do naturally is publish what their priorities are. You look at the President's State of the Union, you can tell, all right, these 22 things that he specifically mentioned are places where over the next year, the White House is going to do something on them. They just launched the National Cybersecurity Plan, right? You know that is some place that there is a group of people, anything the President mentions in his speech of the State of the Union, there's a group of people working on that inside the administration. And so it's literally a blueprint to the things that they care about right now. And if something you care about deeply is part of that, they're going to want to know what's out there and what's the best data and who is really digging in on this topic, and having the backing of an educational institution like this to help you generate that conversation with a policymaker is really important. In terms of places that people read, I think there is a clipping service that takes essentially creates clips for everybody every morning. Most people skip right over that and actually go and read firsthand resources. Medium is a very popular place for people to spend a lot of time in the morning and trying to figure out what works, what people are writing about and what they care about. And then I think people, especially in the more academic parts of the White House, spend a lot of time talking to their former colleagues in academia to understand what research is happening, and then to help shape it, to pose questions, to say, we're looking at retirement. We want to know what percentage of people sign up automatically for retirement accounts when they join a new job and which percent don't, and what are the hurdles that are in their way. There are academic researchers doing that work, and that data is being fed right back into the policy process. So that relationship, the resources you guys have that policymakers don't, is incredibly important.
We have time for one last question.
Hi, thank you for coming. I just had a quick question. Throughout this conversation, there's been use of words like success and failure. And while it might be obvious in certain cases like healthcare.gov, whether it was a success or a failure, in a lot of these other cases it might not be so obvious. So like, was the Gulf dinner thing effective as like a non-policy intervention, as well as with the unemployment rate and talking to the companies, or not unemployment, but out of work rate? Does the government really dig into the efficacy of a lot of these things? And if so, how? And does it generate any sort of like feedback loops that informs how things are done in the future? Or is it kind of these one-off things that go out and then it's unknown after that?
That's a great question.
I think it depends on what it is, right? So, with the recognition that sometimes it's a very long process. One of my friends at the White House, Tom Khalil, like he was one of the people who sort of initiated
Berkeley's own, yeah.
Berkeley's own, the Human Genome Project, right? He has like these pet rocks that he's like really attached to, and so like every once in a while there's one of these things, and he's like, that was 20 years ago. I don't know if it's a success yet, but I'm hopeful, right? So like these things where the thing you want to see success in, you may not see in your generation, but you think you're on the right path. That's one metric on the success or failure. But there are others that are shorter term. So in the big data report that we issued, we identified in it some priorities, right? So we think that there should be a real focus on the use of educational data, on police data, on data for precision medicine. And in fact, 2 of those components are now initiatives within the White House. So there's a precision medicine initiative. It was announced 6 months ago. And they just did an update. They imposed upon themselves a progress report. How far have we gotten in the precision medicine initiative? Even if it's a long-term thing, in 6 months they put together a set of principles on privacy and trust, which I think is a great first step for that particular area. They have a police data initiative where they were encouraging police departments around the country to open up their data about police interactions with the public. And in fact, now they've done a 5-month progress report. There are 26 jurisdictions that have now opened up their police interaction data that range from officer-involved shootings to stop and frisk. And like, that's huge. And so I think that there is some cases where like you're waiting, and then there are some where they impose a progress report on themselves to measure not so much success or failure, but progress and a sense for, are we headed in the right direction with it?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And that it's a great question in part because the White House definitely falls victim, probably more so than any place else in the federal government, to short-termism and push something out the door, and immediately there are 7 other things looking for your attention, so you move right on to it. So an issue like the long-term unemployed, getting the feedback loop started from the beginning is really important, and often, we learn to just repeat things over and over. You find something that uses a tool that works, and you do it. So for that policy issue, we had an event in January to bring all the companies in, the 100 companies that had committed to it. And then we told them at that event, we can't wait to see you in November, where you're going to come back and share with us what progress you've made and the success that you have had. And why don't you bring with you a couple of workers that you've hired that were long-term unemployed before today. And so you just have to set those expectations. You're going to do it. Now, 100 companies each bring 2 workers, that's a couple hundred people. That's not going to make a dent in the unemployment rate, but the impact that they had more broadly in their workforce was the thing we cared about, and we wanted to try to set up some mechanisms for us to make sure that they were actually following through in their commitments. But I think it's both an interesting question about in a place that's perpetually under-resourced, like the White House is, how do you incentivize follow-up, and things like building in your progress report is a great way to do that. But is there also a role, as more and more of this becomes open and transparent and the data is readily available, a role for third parties to play some of that role in showing progress or not progress over time? And the more transparent you are about what your goals are and how you're going to measure it, it allows other folks to do that. I think that's a place that we could certainly improve a lot on in some of these bigger policy areas.
No, I wanted to say thanks so much to both of you for a great meeting.
Thank you.